How to Boost Sales of Podcast Guests as a title. We're going to talk about podcast data and how to use it and different ways of using it to generate sales. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through quite a lot of data and stuff, some processes, and then I'm going to talk through, like in a workshop style demo, just actually how to find podcasts to be a guest on, how to find podcast data around that side. Obviously, I'm fully merged up. We're going to talk about Podcast Talk, but I'm also going to show you the other ways to do it as well. So it's not a promo thing, it's just a mechanism around that. So I'll give you a bit of background on who Podcast Talk is and where we've come from and why the idea and that sort of thing as well. There's a chap called Ray Blackney, who I've never met in my life. He's my business partner. So you would only do that in a weird world that we live in now of actually COVID, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. If I was to tell my old friends in corporate land about this, which I probably will do at Christmas time, they'd just be laughing and not get it. So me and Ray came at this at different angles, and Ray came at it first. I was helping him with some channel business for his other business. Conversation about this, and then we came together and we've been working together ever since. But like I say, we've been in the same room in 2018, but we've not met each other, bizarrely enough. So we will be meeting next year. So Matt Che, you may know from Trends. So he's been, I think 12 months now, he's been helping out on a part-time basis. So he still does calendar desk as well, but he's also part of the team acting as our CTO. So we had a team originally that was building it out MVP-wise and stuff, and Matt Che joined us, and it's been awesome ever since. So for those that don't know Pat Flynn, he's been around for a long time. Smart Passive Income, he's one of our advisors. He's on our board. And also Jordan Harbinger as well, top 10 podcaster. He's interviewed everybody. He is awesome. Not that Pat isn't awesome as well, but they're our advisors. So we've got a good steering group. So it gives you a bit of context on the company. Finally, though, you don't have to listen to that bit anymore, and we're over technology. Let's talk about the data. So I'm going to talk, and there is context behind this. It's not just let's go on for 10 slides of data. There's quite a lot of data to take in. But what I want to show and demonstrate is the size of podcasts as a whole, the niches, the sectors, the audience, how you can get the reach. Because there's no point in talking about how to sell through podcasts if there's only 3 people and they're all in Lancashire in England, that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about that, and it's something that isn't really, it is spoken about. There's quite a lot of data around podcasts in general, these sort of stats around that sort of podcast size. But I've took some data and reviewed it on our side, and I'll talk about that around it. So again, we've got 4.2 million podcasts in our database. We've got now more than 120 million episodes, because this was from 2 weeks ago. And we're also transcribing some of those episodes as well. And we'll get to that later on. Start to see some growth in different territories from a sort of language listening experience. So Mexico, Sweden, again, from a Spanish language perspective. And again, people don't talk about this, but podcasting as a market size, $23 billion is just growing. I was just looking at some numbers today, and it's actually starting to accelerate and get growth even quicker. I just couldn't get them in the deck because I couldn't ratify the data points from there. And again, from an advertising perspective, if you don't want to do any of this and you just want to spend some money rather than Google Ads, you can target your audience really quickly by dropping some adverts in there, and people are listening. Quick overview.
I had a question, Stewart, on market size. What are the inputs for that? Are you guys looking at sort of sponsorships and what companies are spending on sponsorships? Any private podcast data? What are you guys looking at to gauge market size?
Yeah, so these are all based on Nielsen and some other sort of data sources as well. So these are all, these are our data sources. These are all vetted data sources where there's reports done on an annual basis, like with the advertising aspect, that's all monitored. And for those that may not be aware, if you have a podcast and you've got X amount of downloads and you've got X amount of advertising, etc., that data you don't reveal. It's not public. It's not something that I could go and say, oh, actually, Drew's got a podcast. How many downloads does he have? How many listeners? I don't know. So Drew could say, I've got 5,000 or I've got 50,000. So it's only the host and the hosting companies that have that data. And what happens is there's Nielsen and some other data providers that do reports on a quarterly and annual basis that get that anonymized data, I can never say that word, and pull these reports together to show the size of growth. So in terms of some data points that I can give you from our database and backed up with Pod Index as well. So that's how many shows that we had in the database as of 7 days ago, 4,238,520. And then in terms of shows that have been published in the last 90 days, nearly 500,000 shows. And what you've got to remember, these are active shows, podcasts with people putting time and effort in, talking about entrepreneurship, business, marketing, coffee, fishing, whatever it may be, that have been published that will have a target audience against it, a very specific audience against it that are listening into those shows. And that's why they're remaining active. And these are really key figures, because what we're comparing about is other marketing methods or sales methods, which is I'll do outbound calling, I'll do some blog posts, I'll do some outreach and some sort of contextual type touch points from it. But I think I'm going to hit my audience, but I'm not quite sure. Podcasting, if you're selling fishing gear and there's a podcast about fishing and they're doing episodes, the audience likes fishing. It's a very simple targeting method from that side. But yeah, I just want to highlight some of those data points from it in terms of the number of shows, and the acceleration point is just growing and growing more rapidly. And we call them active shows. That's the thing to measure around that, because what does happen is podcasts, if they get over 10 or 15 shows, they've got momentum, they'll keep on rolling down the hill. If they get to 7 shows and they stop, they're not going back. So it's in the world of blog posting and content marketing, there's lots of dead content out there, which there is a business model around that as well, but we won't talk about that today.
One thing I'd like to add, and I would love your thoughts on this, Stewart, is a trick I heard from Seth Godin, where a lot of people pitch him on coming on their shows. And he has this threshold of, I think it's if you publish 30 episodes, then sure, he'll come on your podcast, but less than 30, then he won't and reach back out. And the reason why I'm sharing this for the people who are attending and who are going to watch the recording is that if you're filtering shows to pitch with you as a guest, you might want to use a similar filter, because if that's going to remain an active show, if that has a little bit of Lindy effect attached to it, then your episode is going to have more legs, because you have evidence that hosts will continue as well. So that might be a rule of thumb you could use the filter.
Yeah, most definitely. And when we get to demo and a walkthrough, that's a key filter. It's one of the sort of most important metrics, because the last thing you want to do is spend time pushing 30, 40 minutes of conversation on a show, and then it doesn't get published. That does happen as well. So it's a key criteria. Just a caveat with this data now. So this is a blend of data that I've took snapshots across our database and also sample data as well. The numbers will not add up to 4.2 million or 120 million or anywhere like that. It was just, I wanted to do something to show some distribution type models and some snapshots of data around it. So don't call me out about the maths, because the maths will be wrong. So if we look, again, when we're looking across the data, so we've got machine learning models that are going across all the shows and episodes as well to pull this data point out. I was quite surprised, because there's a lot of conversation in the podcasting sector. There isn't a lot of female hosts. There is a lot of female hosts. What they are is tend to be single shows, though, rather than interview style shows from that side. Whereas from a male perspective, there's a lot of male hosts that are hosting more interview style shows. So you tend to get ladies that all have a particular sector, and they'll either do it on their own or they'll be talking to another lady or a chat. Whereas with men, they'll go, you know what, I'm going to do the easy route. I'm going to just do interviews. I'm going to interview everybody else, because then I don't have to think about it. Because we are inherently lazy, basically, from that side. But yeah, I was quite surprised. And it was a figure that I shared with a friend of mine that runs a boutique podcast agency just for women. And she was quite surprised by it. I'm like, there's the data, I'll show you from that side. So again, there's a reasonable split across the sector. And then if we look at language distribution, obviously English, yeah, we get that side. Spanish in multiple formats, whether it's European Spanish, Brazilian, Mexican, etc., is starting to become a very dominant and prevalent language across podcasting. So it's broadcasting its natural language. The guests are on there as well. So again, don't think of podcasting as just a one-trick pony that everything is in English. You can only target the English market. And this was one of the reasons that Ray was going for podcasts, because he's Spanish speaking and he was targeting the Spanish speaking market. And this was 3 or 4 years ago. So we're starting to see some growth there as well, some acceleration from the language perspective. And then, in terms of countries, yeah, US is big, Mexico's growing, United Kingdom is a bit small, but again, we've got a wider reach. So from this data, this is data where we've gone and matched up and done some machine learning models, because basically, if you're a podcast host, you will tend to put your description in your native language, but when you're tagging it to go to the hosting company, the people that are going to host your podcast, a lot of hosts put it that it's in English and they're in America, because it gets them into a different category and different tables and stuff. So we've gone through and identified the language in the podcast description, some of the show data to match and go, actually the category, it says it's English in the US. We've actually identified it's in Canada or Australia or Italy by some of the language and some of the mentions and stuff in there. And again, this is not across all the data sets, an ongoing aspect. But you can see there's a wide reach of countries and territories to go out to. And some of these, you may be reaching into the German market, but actually they're English podcasts in Germany, or they could be in German around it. But it just gives you that wider perspective from a sort of territory perspective. Don't think that when you're reaching out from a sort of sales model and you want to generate some leads, that you're just incumbent to just being in the US. You can break out into new territories. And the language follows the same, Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah, we think about that. There is a lot of Chinese podcasts. I was really surprised by this as well. So I'm going out to double check some of these numbers. And we've got this tag United Nations, which is just unidentified language. We've gone back and looked at that model again, because that's obviously not real, but we kept it in for a bit of a laugh from that sort of side. But you've got multiple different sort of languages in there where these podcasts are actually in their native language. And you've got those ones that are coming through that are growing, like, say, Spanish and such. But if you're looking to break into the Japanese market and you're potentially thinking, actually, I'd like to find some podcasts I want to advertise on or want to sponsor, again, you can do. So this is where we're starting to talk about reach now. So if we look with this one, we extracted all the shows that we could get social identity on, we have in our database, and then we did a lookup. So this could be a podcast that's got all 5 of these, or it's got 1 or 2 of them, but it's the counts. So you can see, obviously Facebook, that's growing. A lot of podcasters create their own groups. People like to push their business context on LinkedIn. Twitter, I was amazed at, or X, I should put in there. I can't put X. Just shoot me now. Please don't let me put X in there. Twitter was quite a good mechanism for a lot of podcast hosts as well. But the biggest request we had over the last 6 months has been, I want to find that have a YouTube presence or are doing a video style podcast and it's going on YouTube. Not live, but they're doubling up their episodes. So they've got the audio content and they're also pushing out their YouTube content as well. It's been the biggest request. And I'm just running some data reports now to look at the trend line based on time period. I'm looking back over the last 18 months to see if we can match the growth of when the podcast started. If it started January the 1st this year, and it did 10, 15, 20 shows, when did it actually start its YouTube channel? Did it have a plan? Did it have a strategy? Or was it 20 shows in or 30 shows in that decided, actually I'm going to start putting this on YouTube, just to see the trend across these sort of social networks aspects. And I think what we'll see is, we'll see out the gate that people will put stuff on Twitter or LinkedIn as such, and YouTube will come a little bit later, or we'll get an underlying trend that is everybody's starting new, is starting to do YouTube out the gate. Yeah, we're starting to see big traction from that side, most definitely. And definitely with some of the clients that we talk to, a lot of them now are saying, I just want to be on shows that have a YouTube presence. I do want the podcast, but we'll talk about this a little bit later, again, by what's the thinking behind that.
It looks like Kevin has a question.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, Stewart, any speculation or theories of why that's the case? Is it like they're targeting people who are more likely to be on their desktop, who could get to the lead, or
so there's a couple of reasons. One, YouTube's heavily investing in podcasting sector and realized that they missed out on it, and they're pushing that content heavily. But also, we call it sort of 10 times content regenerations. If you think about a podcast and how you can reformat that, I'm still in my own thunder now. If you think about your podcast, I was on a podcast last Thursday. It was a video podcast. And what I can then do is I can take that podcast and do a standard marketing aspect of, I can chop that up into some audiograms, and that's great. And I'll push those out on social, and that's fab. But if I've got video content, suddenly I've got 59-second reels, Instagram reels, YouTube shorts, all these pieces of content with transcriptions, I can do intros and outros, and I can chop that up, a 30-minute episode, into sort of 10 key points, get it across multiple platforms and drive more traffic from it. Because again, it's just that whole aspect of short attention span, key points are in. I can't remember the tool that I use, but there's loads of them where it's literally, I just dump it in there and it puts my little sort of captions running across. It looks all funky, there's visuals and everything, and that gets people's attention. So a lot more people from a guesting perspective who are trying to drive a call to action sales are going that route, because also then they can drop underneath that really simply of, if you want to know more, go and listen to the podcast, and also go and buy this, go and do this, do the call to action. So yeah, there's two aspects. There's definitely YouTube's investment over the last 2 years in podcasting space and their time and effort around that, but also the content aspect as well. It's a much more powerful medium to share out than just audiograms on their own around that side. And it's part of the reason that hosts are doing that as well.
Cool, thank you.
No props. So this data point is just explaining this. So a podcast has its product per se hosted somewhere. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I don't know if Anchor FM's going now as part of Spotify or it's just Spotify. They're on hosting platforms, multiple ones of them, Google Podcasts. And people go there and they listen to it, and that's great. When we say external websites, this is something like Pat Flynn's got his podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts. That's great. Also, Pat has got patflynn.com. So that's the website. And then on patflynn.com, you've got /podcast as well. So you've got a page for the podcast. So we went through our data and mined through it, and we found I thought it'd be more than this, but it's we'll call it 250,000 podcast shows that have external websites that aren't Anchor FM or Spotify, etc. from that side. So there's a big reach, and this is going down the lane of we'll go to next, which is how far can you reach? If you're going on podcasts, how far can you reach and get out to an audience that, again, very highly targeted and specific. So these numbers are correct. I've checked them so many times. That is billion. So we've got multiple we've got a sample of podcasts that we've then got third-party APIs to build out the number of backlinks and to the website itself and page ranking backlinks as well. So we will see when we walk through this, but essentially those 20,000 sites have got all the backlinks pointing back at them from various domain authority places. What that means in the grand scheme of things is if you go on those podcasts with a target plan of I want to get reach and I want to get a backlink come back to me that's got a high domain authority, I can either try and do that through blogging, and the random emails that I get asking to be on Podcast Hort's blog, I don't know why, because I've got a very low domain authority. But if you've got a plan about building domain authority backlinks, podcast is a really simple, easy way to do it, because essentially you can get a link back on that site at the end of every show, and you could do a show a day if you want to. But yeah, caveat is that is a small sample set. We go through a third party to get this data, and we just did a big chunk of the top 20,000 podcasts. And obviously that over time that'll change and it'll go up and down. We're pulling new data in, but that was more just a contextual aspect of when people talk. I keep saying the word podcast loads of times, I know. When people talk about this route to market to sell, they don't think about it in this context of, I've got something I want to do, I'm going to invest some time in it, so I can either write a blog post, do a marketing campaign, do outbound email, or I can go in a highly targeted show, and I've got a plan and a strategy to go and find those podcasts in my niche that have high domain authority and put a request in to make sure that my link goes on their website and gets crawled. so they have a plan around that side. And this is the core of what we're talking about today.
A quick question about that, Stewart. We have Emin here, who's our editor slash analyst slash marketer. And I was having a conversation with him recently about why we prioritized the release of podcasts, the Trends podcast. And part of the reasoning was around looking at the distributors for podcasts, where you have Amazon Music and Apple and Spotify, where if you were to produce a podcast and provide backlinks to your site, and all of these distributors are picking it up, then perhaps that affects your domain authority in a positive way. I'm not sure how true that is, but have you heard any conversations or insights? Yeah.
Again, it's when we look at, so if you look at Anchor FM, I keep saying Anchor FM, Spotify, but I'll call it Anchor FM, it's stuck in my head. Anchor FM and those sort of things, they have a very high domain authority, but those links are pointing back to you, and they do have weighting. How much weighting that impact has overall, I've not done a sort of test around it, but it still has value there. It's like getting listed anywhere, isn't it, that's got a high domain authority. Google still counts it from that side, but it may not put it in such a weighting. What we're looking at is more if you look at your, we'll say drewriley.com page, and you've got the podcast going on and it's pointing back at that, and it's coming from Pat Flynn's website, the amount of traffic that we get from Ray being on Pat Flynn's podcast is really high. And the amount of love that we get from that backlink is really high because it's qualified from that side. So yeah, it's definitely an area to look at and focus from that side, is building out those backlinks using that. But those hosting companies will have some weighting, but I would personally say not as much as other platforms, I think. So if we look again, I did a little sample of categories. So this isn't all the categories, there's too many to list, we'll just get bored if we went through them all. But it was looking at where if you wanted to target on a basis, when I was just doing this presentation a couple of weeks ago. So entrepreneurship and marketing are strong from that side. Business was a top tier one. So then you've got business, and underneath that comes entrepreneurship and marketing. And it's really interesting. I was looking at self-improvement going, really? And fitness? Well, why does nobody want to talk about business? Who wants to talk about getting healthy and stuff like that? Those sectors are smashing it, my God. And again, drilling back into some of that data points, they're very much a blend of interview style that you can go on, but a lot of people just, I suppose, talking about themselves and talking about sort of educational type content more from that side of things. But category wise, the world is your oyster, and we're going to go through that as well. But yeah, if there's a category that you're looking at target, there's a podcast that will sit in that category that will have a wide audience. So that data I've just talked about there, basically that comes from a subset of, you've got a show, so it'll be the Stewart Townsend podcast, that's great. And underneath that, you've got episodes. So today on the Stewart Townsend podcast, we're interviewing Kevin. And then at the end of that, we've got the transcript. And all of that has got metadata in it that is totally like gold dust, untapped gold dust, as I call it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And I know it seems a lot of talk about data and context, but again, I just want to show that value in actually where we're going, because otherwise it makes no sense in looking at how to generate leads or do anything at all if we're not talking about the sort of data and insights that you can get. So the show description is actually the podcast itself, and that has some basic details in there. So this is what we get at the moment. This is what we provide at the moment. So it's some details about the guest. You can get the description, mentions products around that side of things. I like the sort of I'm a bit of a nerd, so I like the sort of positive, negative sentiment around it as well. And then also, is there a call to action in there from that side? But for me, in terms of that show description, like I said, this is the bit that we're working on, it's not live at the moment, is, so if you want to look at your sector, say you sell into customer service, and I used to work at Zendesk, so it's always there. So I'm Zendesk, I'm in customer service, and I want to look at who are my competitors are out there, what are they mentioning? Are they sponsoring shows? Are they talking about elements around the next set of roadmaps and stuff? I can pull that out of show descriptions if somebody from Zendesk has been on there. I did a quick search before, and there's been just over 4,000 shows with Zendesk mentioned in it. So somebody from Zendesk has been on 4,000 shows, not one person. God, that'd be painful. beautiful. But there's all insights of data in there that you can get. And then if we look at show transcript, so this is the conversation that takes place. So what you can start to pull out there is elements of, have they done any quotes? Is there some stats or elements that they talked about? They may not have meant to mention some of those stats, but they did. Again, is there a story that you can use? So if you're doing some outreach in sales, and I was on a show and I was talking about, I love cars, and I did this car show and it was great, and I saw my favorite car. Again, it's not a cold, it's a warm, cold email that's going out now, because you've got some points. It's like, hey Stewart, heard you on a show and you're talking about this. I love cars as well, and that's great, and blah, blah, blah. It starts to make it a bit more of an engaging conversation when you're talking about outreach around that. And also about the credibility side. You can start to understand how credible somebody is if you try to sell to them. So you get it. I've talked about data for about 40 minutes without telling you anything, but there's lots of information that can be extracted that is very different from the type of data if you're doing outreach using LinkedIn or standard sort of outreach type SDR methodologies. So you've built a cold list, you're reaching out to people, you're doing a generic email, you're sending them a personalized video that's not personalized, but you think it's personalized. There is no contextual aspect in there apart from if you've been on LinkedIn or Twitter or some social aspects and they've mentioned some personal things or some other elements around that. But that's going to be really hard work to try and get them and pull it all together. So if we look at where LinkedIn is and where we see podcast data going from that side, there's lots of elements. Again, not all the time, it's elements that could be discussed from that side. Whereas again, with LinkedIn, it's a very static component of Stewart works at this job and, oh, he's done some posts about X, Y, Z. That's great. You don't really get a flavor of sort of that personal aspect, or has Stewart been at a trade show? Who's he met? What's the sort of component of some of the personality traits, those sort of components around that. So for us, we're building out this platform that is going to be LinkedIn on steroids, which is actually giving sort of more personalized contextual data around people and individuals. And this is perfectly legal. It's GDPR compliant because the data is processed in the US from that side. We've got a lawyer on that at the moment, just making sure that we don't go to prison, which is always good. But it's not the data itself, because the person has made it public, it's the actual processing of the data and extracting the insights into it. Does that, I know it's quite sort of bamboozle sort of stuff, does that give you some contextual sense? Get that podcasting is quite large, it's a big market, and there's volumes of data there that you can use to generate some sales.
Yep, absolutely.
So quickly jump in. So in terms of that data, so what do you do? How do you use it? And we will get to actually, I'll show you properly, but there's a couple of methodologies around that. So for me, we've already talked and gone over it a little bit, but personal insights. So starting to gather some information on that person so you can communicate with them, reach out to them, start to build that relationship with them based on contextual information around that sort of thing. Have they moved jobs recently and they're on a new podcast? What did they do in their old one around that aspect? This is my favorite one. So we call it lookalike audiences. I carbosh this every time I try and explain it, but it's really simple. So, sorry, Drew, I'm going to pick on you again. Drew's been on a podcast and he's been talking about really intelligent stuff, and it's great. So if we want to target people like Drew, we want to find a lookalike audience. So we go and look at the show that Drew's been on, find the guests either side of those shows that Drew's been on, and then go and find other shows those guests have been on. So that's a lookalike audience. So Drew's been on that show. I'll look to 3 months either side of that show, get a list of all the guests, then go and find all the other shows those guests have been on. And that again becomes a highly targeted base to reach out to in terms of either going on that show because you want to go and promote what you're doing, finding out about competitor information. So lookalike, again, we'll lookalike from that perspective. And then you start to use that for your outreach component around it. And this is what we've been building some back-end reports around this side to automate all this. So literally, I've been testing it with me. So I'll look up what shows I've been on, which are normally marketing or entrepreneurship around that sort of side. And then I'll go and find the other guests either side. And it'll be, actually, there's some shows that I should be on because either my competitors or these other guests are on there as well. It makes it a whole lot simpler rather than you looking to be on shows or go guesting on shows and you think, oh, that one's okay, it's not too bad, it makes it a lot easier. And then it just builds your list very quickly. Rather than saying, I'm going to go on 100 shows, you go on 25 highly targeted shows based on that audience. And to me, this is going to be a game changer, because suddenly, again, when I was talking to some potential clients about this and looking at how they could use it, they were like, actually, we'd like to look at getting the details on those guests that have been on there as well, because then we can go and find out who they are and sell to them as well. And then we can also look at being on the shows, so that's the other method. But actually, we also want to look at advertising and sponsorship as well. So let's extract lookalike podcasts. So Zendesk has sponsored the show that Drew's been on. Let's look at either side. Here's the guess. What are the other shows? Oh, Zendesk isn't sponsoring there, but they're the same audience, the same listener base. Let us sponsor that as well. So there's multiple scenarios around it. It's basically just doing some machine learning, some data modeling in the background to make it happen around that side. And it may not be the biggest list in the world, but it'll be always very highly targeted and very focused on that side. That is the big project we're working on in the background at the moment. And we're doing that with, I think we've just extracted at the moment about 1 million shows that we're looking at, just to do a sort of baseline around it. Some of the 1 million sort of top interview style shows with lots of guests on, so we can start to build a cluster map around that and start to segment it out. So it'll be the name of the guests, the company they work for, some of the social aspects, the domain authority, the backlinks, all that sort of thing. And then linking that's linked back to the podcast show itself. And then the other use case is building a list of sponsors as well. So we can build a list very quickly of, if you're in the fishing sector, I don't know why it keeps coming to my head, but you're in the fishing sector and you want to sponsor the fishing shows, yeah, we can show you all the people that are sponsoring all the podcasts in the fishing sector, and then find the white space of, yeah, and these 25 or 50 or 100 podcasts have got potential, they're up and coming, why don't you start to get in there and start to sponsor them early on before your competitors do?
Had a question, Stewart, or a comment rather, another use case that revolves around competition. If you have a founder that's relatively familiar with like their competitors, who the founders are, it also seems like you could use that as a jumping off point of what shows have they been on, and then finding the similar shows there. You compared, I think it was podcast to LinkedIn earlier, but I'm also thinking about how companies and competitors compete for keywords. You could possibly get guest spots on those same podcasts as well, like another metaphor.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, that sort of use case around, say, the founders that are coming through type of thing, we're targeting them at the moment, but we're actually getting that data and then actually going to them and saying, we're not going to sell to you. We're just going to say, here's 50 podcasts you should be on, because your competitors have been on a similar type of audience. These have got spots or they've been on these sort of shows. So we're going to proactively go out with our data to go and speak to people like that in sectors as well, and target that based on, they've just took Series A, they're looking to expand the business and do some growth. It's a nice time to go and speak to them and grab them. But yeah, founders are definitely a good target space.
That sounds like a powerful pitch.
Yeah, too much to do. So again, like I say, we talked about this, but literally you can start to target your competitors in terms of pain points, roles. Have they been at conferences? What's the type of customer they talk about? They may drop in nuggets about future roadmaps and expansion, consultants or the companies they work with. All those sort of things can be found in that transcript. And again, caveat, not all the time, but data points that can be extracted out to use for targeting for sales and lead generation. Yeah, we've done the data now. We've done it from that side. So how do we actually sell? So I'm going to run through this and I'm going to actually show you finding some of this data as well. So there's three methodologies, per se. So you could either set up your own podcast, be a guest on a podcast, or just use the data to sell through. And the third part is the bit that we're working on at the moment. So caveat, that's not live yet from that side. So we're selling the dream before we even have it. But there's benefits of all of them. But actually, your own podcast is great. You own the brand. You get to build a network. If you've got a high domain authority website and traffic already, you can start to push that and monetize through and start to bring advertising through to it. And it gives you multiple revenue streams around it. The downside is, if you go to set up a podcast, I have, it's painful, especially if you're doing an interview style. You need to have at least 10 to 15 shows pre-recorded before you go live, and be very structured in how you do it and start to grow it as well. So it does take a lot of time and effort. The lazy way, which is my way, is being a guest on another show, and it's called the Pat Flynn method, Pat Flynn effect around that. Was it 10 years ago? 10 to 12 years ago? Yeah, 10 years ago. John Lee Dumas was he'd been going a year, so he's doing one podcast a day. That was his thing. And he was looking for ways to grow and expand his reach, and decided, I'll go and be a guest on other people's podcasts. That seems quite sensible. So he went on Pat Flynn's podcast and started to get an increase. Again, you can see on there in his social media, his subscribers, he got growth. And this was 10 years ago. Obviously, John doesn't have to do that now. He didn't have to do it for a while as well around it, but it's actually him that wrote and called it the Pat Flynn effect. And that is actually a term that's come about. So by being a guest, you can start to get that reach around it from it. But again, there's pros and cons around it. So yeah, it's less effort. Like last week, I was on a show, I just turned up, I had my crazy hat on, I spoke for 30 minutes, and then I'm now waiting for the host to send me that material, and they'll give me all the marketing material and do all the hard work basically for it. I can then turn it into, like I was saying earlier before, Kevin, 10 times content generation. So I can take that show, I can use a transcript for a blog post, I can turn it into audiograms, I can turn it into reels and shorts, I can start to share it with potential prospects as well. So it could be I'm reaching out to a prospect and go, I was on the show last week, I was talking about how to use AI in the generative marketing team and what the importance is, thought you may be interested in it. Boom, there's a link. So you can use it as an opening conversation around that side as well, because you've been talking to that audience as well. And it gives you that credibility. So you can be an expert in anything. You could go on 10 podcasts and be an expert because you've been on 10 podcasts from that side. And of course, there's always a downside around it. Brand ownership, that sort of thing, you don't own it, but you do own your own identity. You own your own brand. It's just that you don't have that full platform to go out on. And then the final component is what we've been talking about, the dream, which is the data sales. So if you want to target an audience that you want to reach out to and get data and use that data to reach out to them. So it may be you're looking for something very particular. So a female Spanish marketing sector, and you want to outreach to them and drive engagement. So you can do that with podcasts very easily and very quickly. So we can provide that data to either do that and do outreach, or you go on a show and you get outreach to that audience. But it's all, the thing for me that I know I say it, and I'll keep saying it, is it's so highly targeted, it's ridiculous. It's literally the most targeted platform method of reaching an audience on the planet. Of people, I do it now. I listen to my podcasts and I'm listening. I may be in the car, I may be I'm doing my walk in the morning, I may be having whatever it is, I'm listening. When I'm reading a blog post or I'm reading an email or any of that sort of aspect, I'm maybe 30 or 40% engaged. With a podcast, I'm listening because I want to hear those nuggets. I want to know what's being said. I want to hear the sort of information that's going to be really engaging, that's going to change my life type of thing from that. And hearing an audio in itself is a very receptive way to get people to trust you. So if you're going on a podcast and you're talking about AI, generative stuff, or how to fix a car engine, whatever it may be, the voice always conveys trust more than the written word does, and visuals definitely help with that as well. So,
something else that comes to mind, Stewart, when it comes to trust is it feels like you're also borrowing trust from the host of, hey, I've been listening to Pat Flynn for 3 or 4 years and I trust him. So by virtue of that, I trust Stewart, because Pat wouldn't have Stewart on his show if he doesn't trust him. So there's a sort of piggybacking on trust that happens as well. Plus, I'm hearing your voice. That's a richer connection, right? You're in my ear for an hour or so.
I'm going to steal that, Drew. Borrowing trust from the host. I like that. Yeah, which you are, because basically, again, it's not as simple as sending a million emails out and get booked on shows. Hosts, it's their brand, and they own that brand. So they're not just going to say, hey, rock up and away we go. You have to earn their trust and respect to go on the show. So that's a great little soundbite there, because that audience then goes, oh, Stuart's been on the show, great, yeah, he's okay, he's not an idiot, fantastic. And it's like an endorsement. So what we're going to do now is actually, I'm going to show you something live. Not talking about any more data side of things, but I'm just demonstrate to you that I'm not just talking waffle and there's no credibility behind it. So if you bear with me, I will find my other. Nobody else is from the nobody else is from the UK, are they? They won't know the concept of Blue Peter and something that I prepared earlier. That's all.
No, I don't think we have any UK folks.
No.
After this live demo, I wonder if we could do another one. Maybe Kevin, for example, he runs a business where he helps you find executive assistants. I'll drop a link here if you're open to doing a live demo, Stewart.
Yeah, I did have the tabs prepared before. And
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, I would be looking forward to seeing that as well.
There we go. Too many browsers. Gosh. Now can you see the Podcast Sort dashboard?
Yep.
Yep, that's okay. Great. So there's a couple of methods to find podcasts. So what, again, I'll caveat this in terms of what I'm going to show you here is our B2C, B2B model that only has the podcast show data in at the moment. So the user interface and all the filters and everything are on the show. What I was talking about with the data on podcast show descriptions and transcripts is in beta in the back end and is just a piece of string in terms of no nice front end to it. So we're doing customer reports and stuff. Still all able to do it. It's just not as beautiful as this and drop down, that sort of aspect. So that side of the business, we're building out some front end stuff for that over the next sort of couple of quarters to get that live. But in the meantime, we're doing some customer reporting and testing as well. And it's a bit like anything. Before we go really gung-ho, I'm going to try and sell the hell out of it and get people to buy it to make sure actually people do want to buy it. And it's just not me being dead excited because I love data. I'm sat there in a world of data going, it's great. And I was like, yeah, I don't really want that. I just want my LinkedIn stuff. So in terms of how you would look for podcasts now, and again, I'm totally open and transparent. There's a couple of other people on the market that have data sources. Listen Notes has been around a long time. Raphonic is a company based in London that do something similar to us. Podchaser took, I think it was about 10 million about 18 months ago, or maybe more. They've got a lot of data on there doing stuff. If you're not subscribed or using any of those services, this is what Ray and me used to do, and what a lot of agencies do as well. You go to the world of death of iTunes podcasting, and you go through and try and find podcasts that sound interesting from a title. Or you go on Spotify and you do it. Or you go and look for interview style marketing. I want to be a marketing podcast. I'll go and look at these lists. And essentially, you can start here, and then you may find a podcast and go, great, I'm going to go on Eric's podcast. That sounds amazing. But is it an interview style podcast? Excuse me. Yeah, so I'll have to read through here, and there's some people that say they've been on his show, so it's definitely an interview. That's great. But actually, there's no website details. So again, this is the Blue Peter moment. In the interest of time, I prepared it earlier. So I've done a Google search and I've found Eric's website. There is no email address on there. So if I want to contact him to go on the podcast, I'm going to do a contact form. And in the meantime, I'm going to have a quick look and see what's his YouTube channel like and how many LinkedIn followers he's got and that sort of thing. So
did you feel like you were really close to losing it all every day?
Yeah, I felt like that every day. So you can see there, literally I've just spoke for about 2 or 3 minutes, and this is one that I prepared earlier. If I was to do that sort of properly, I'd have to go through here or go through these lists and try and find them and do that individually. So if I'm targeting 100 podcasts, do the maths. Give it to a VA. Even a VA would want to shoot themselves because literally it's the most boring task on earth. So up until a couple of years ago, this was the method that would use to find podcasts to be on and be a guest on and go and do outreach around that site. So it's just not very exciting at all. So in terms of podcasting, Kevin, do you want to, we can just do it live in terms of if you want to look for podcasts that will be relevant to you as a business, that'll make more contextual sense because otherwise I'll just talk about marketing. What is it? What's your business about again?
I have an executive assistant agency. So we hire Philippines executive assistants who are experienced, and then we match them with US-based, typically founders right now.
Right.
And then we equip them with tech also for their common tasks. So I write scrapers for them and things like this.
Yeah. So you're hiring, or you're providing a service to, we'll say SaaS founders. That's probably the easiest thing. a VA that's doing tasks and helping them grow and stuff. That's something we should have a conversation, because that's definitely something I could do some help with from that side. So if you were looking to promote your business, how do you do that now? Where's sort of your genre, in a sense? Where would you do a blog post or an outreach marketing, or what? I'm trying to gauge the type of shows that you'd want to be on. So
I can tell you right now, like, our only channel so far has been organic within On Deck Slack, On Deck, the startup founder community.
Yeah.
To give you more puzzle pieces, our competitors, one of them is called AthenaGo.com, and they were started by the co-founder of Thumbtack, Jonathan Swanson. And so they will go on a few podcasts, and then some of Athena's guests have brought them a lot of business by going on podcasts like Tim Ferriss Show, if you heard of. That was a pretty popular one with Sam Korkos from Levels Health. He gave a shout out to Athena. I brought them in some good business.
So what I would say with your business then is, it coming under I'm going to say entrepreneurship is going to be the main category from that side. And you can go wider, and we could put in founders. In fact, let's just try founders, because I've not done that for a while. I'm going to start from scratch. So before I start, I'll just show you. So when they were saying before about the searching and the data points and stuff around that side of things, so we have all these we call filters, power filters or general filters in the platform. So they start with obviously the podcast title, so the actual show itself, the description that the host puts in, the category, episode dates, the numbers. We've got our own scoring system, which is a metric that's always moving. Again, number of reviews, and then did they have social media? So that's where we started. A couple of months ago, we started to add extra data points, third-party data points, and this is where we come back to domain ranking authority. Did they have an external website from that side? What is the gender of the host? Is it an interview style? What's the language, etc., and the country? So it gives a bit more of a flavour, so more in depth. But again, this at the moment is only based on the actual title, the podcast show itself, not the description. The description has got more gold in it than we can ever want from that side. So if we look at founders, and we will go in, actually, let's look at founders and in the category of entrepreneurship on that side. And again, these categories or any sort of data from that side, which is fixed, is actually what the host provides. And what they tend to do is they'll put it in entrepreneurship and business and marketing and cover all bases from it. But the key element we were talking about before at the start was the number of shows. So if we look at this and go, actually, it's got to be greater than 30. Because if it's less than 30, I don't want to be on that show. And it could be that actually, I don't know, I was going to say the founder of WeWork, but they're going bankrupt, aren't we? So some amazing founder has started a podcast and got a really high domain authority, but has only done 10 shows, and you're going to miss out on it. But that's just life. You tend not to get that anyway from that side of things. And the other key aspect is, has it had a show in the last couple of months or so? Key element, have they released a show? And they're like the 4 key points that you'd search for initially. So that'll go and look for shows that have got the keyword founders in the description, the show description, that's sat in the category of entrepreneurship, that has had more than 30 shows and has had an episode in the last couple of months. And that's brought back 237 entries. So that means they're live, active, focused podcasts that are in the entrepreneur space, that are talking about founders or have got founders around their aspect. And we can then break that down even further and go, actually, I'd like to know those that have got a podcast style of interview, because if they're just talking to themselves, they're not going to get me on there. And again, that starts to filter that down. So you start to build a targeted list that you can reach out to and get some more information on around that. Whereas before we were going up here and we were trying to get some more info and stuff, it's okay. Story of a brand. I thought it was story of Brad then. It's like my glasses have gone wrong. And then we give you all this metadata. So you can start to look at it and go, actually, what's the country? Yeah, it's an interview. How many podcasts have they had? Let's look at their domain ranking. How many backlinks are pointing back to them? What's the page rank against it and the page backlink? So this is actually stewarttownsend.com/podcast around that side of things. And then also I want to go and have a look at the social details as well and see how many followers and things like that they've got. And we did used to pull that data in, but with all the API changes up and down and everything like that, we've retracted it because Twitter or X type of thing was just being a pain, everybody else has been a pain. So we made it that people have to manually go and look at it. So there's one, but suddenly you can see, you can go and find and target podcasts that you'd like to be on just by some of this metadata here, and actually looking at some of their social stuff as well and the website details. And what tends to happen is, like, that's great, but I want to have a look at some of the shows or a bit of a listen as well. So we give the last 5 shows details as well, so you can look at some of the conversations they're having with people, what's being said on the show. You can listen to a component of it as well and just get a little soundbite from there. So essentially, you don't have to go into 15 million tabs. You don't have to go elsewhere to get a baseline of information of targeted shows that you're looking to be on and make a decision of, actually, this sounds really great. It's somewhere I'd like to be on, to go and drive that content out. And especially if we go back to, I said before about YouTube, if we look at social media as YouTube, let's see how this whittles down. Oh wow, more than I thought. So suddenly it's actually, here's my criteria. I want to be on shows that mention this, and that's quite a wide funnel, but I want to be on shows that actually are starting to get some reach, so more than 30. They've had a show in the last sort of couple of months. It's an interview style that I can go on and has a YouTube presence from it. So suddenly you can start to see that actually you've got shows of up and coming domain ranking, may not be the greatest in the world, and it's starting to grow stronger, but you can make a decision of, actually, here's one that I'd really like to be on because it fits in my genre, in my wheelhouse. It's got a YouTube channel. It's starting to grow. It's starting to get some data on there that's interesting to me from that side. And then you can go and click on these and go into that's unusual.
Hey, Stewart, you just showed us some of the recent episode data. I'm curious, with the podcast description, does that also search within some of that recent episode data, or only the podcast description?
Only the podcast description. So if you think of basically the 2 separate databases, you've got the show data with its ID of whatever that one was called. We'll call it the Product Boss podcast. And so you can click on there and have a look. What we don't have is the capability to search in here in this show data at the moment. That's going to be a separate interface because it'll mash people's brains up, basically, because think of it as a sales strategy. We're bringing the wrong data back. So the way we're thinking about it is, you'll do your initial search and you'll find 25 podcasts that seem interesting. And then what you want to do is find either guests or episodes or data point based on those podcasts, and it'll take you off into a new UI that will pull those 25 podcasts in and then allow you to search across that description and transcript data for a period of time. Obviously, we can't do all the shows because you can search all the descriptions. Can't do all the transcripts because it'd just be too much data. It'd be like system overload.
Yeah, it sounds like a hard design problem. Even episode titles would be really interesting, because I just did a cursory search for executive assistants, and there are some interesting podcasts coming up, but only because we are latching onto the episode names. And that might allow you to go very narrow if you were to just to index the episode names.
You can. What I tend to say with people is, the title is never a really good rich field, because it may, ironically enough, it may not be relevant, if that makes sense. So it could be
the episode title rather than the podcast title, the episode title.
The actual podcast title. So if you look here, the Product Boss podcast, it doesn't mention anything about entrepreneurship or founders or anything like that at all, because that's the title, or female startup club, that sort of thing. So sometimes the titles are a little bit rich or less rich, whereas in the description, that's where the host is trying to sell the show as much as possible. It's like and this is where they're plugging the keywords in. This is where they're going SEO gold of, I'm going to get every keyword in possible that iTunes can suck in my podcast description, because it's not the show description per se that is rich from SEO wise. it's the show description is rich in SEO keyword as well, that's tagged, and as well as the episode. So it's like the Wild West of, if I'm about entrepreneurship, my title may be generic, but my description will be buzzword bingo going on there from that side. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll narrow this down a little bit.
Yeah, real quick, just echoing Drew, as a listener of podcasts, if I'm curious about a topic, I will search specifically for episodes and not titles. So that would be really interesting here, like you said, like specifically looking at episode titles that say delegation, let's say.
Yeah, so cool. The actual, like I say, the episodes are indexed or searchable on here at the moment, but that's one of the key criteria. So when those episodes become available, literally like executive assistant or that sort of data point, that'll be in there. That'll be keywords you can just pull out like straight away. And it was one of the rationales was behind this was when we first started out, and even I got confused, was people would come to me and go, I can't find this, I can't find that. Oh, that's really weird, isn't it? Yeah. And then it tweaked, I was like, you're looking for the show description, aren't you? The actual episode description, not the show description. And we got this confusion going on sort of thing. And I was like, actually, why don't we just bring the show data in and make that available? Because that's got more keyword gold in it. The episode data, sorry, it's got more keyword gold in it than the actual show description. And then when we started to play around with it, it was a little bit more complex. 4 million podcasts is reasonably easy to index. 120 million with 500,000 being added every 3 months is a bit more of a challenge. Thankfully, Microsoft Startup Program, big plug to them. We've got lots of credits with them, thankfully. They're awesome. But yeah, with the actual title, it's not coming up. But if we're looking in the actual show descriptions.
Yeah, I actually think for my description or title, if it's in the category of entrepreneurship, I think that would be.
If you're targeting founders, you'd be better off going for a wider funnel than, because look here now, if we're looking executive assistants, that's doing a pure look for these 2 words in the description, no matter where they are, and there's hardly any. There's nine entries, and they're not big shows. But whereas if we're looking at entrepreneurship and you start to narrow that down into target areas, so it may be entrepreneurship and you're looking for podcasts are in the US, or you're looking to target different speaking territories, or you've got a strategy around social outreach, or you want to find ones that have got high domain authority and a web presence and YouTube and all that sort of thing, you can start to narrow it down. And that's the crux of whether it's our tool, whether it's Google or whatever it is. The crux of it is whatever you try to sell, that you have a strategy and that you understand that you can get to that audience, find a highly targeted one, and you don't have to do, please, to take anything away. A lot of agencies do, and we do have an agency, but a lot of agencies do the machine gun approach. Anybody in this sector that works in an agency that sends 1,000 emails to 1,000 podcasts needs like shooting, putting away, because it's just not, it annoys hosts, it's not targeted, and literally, if I went on a show and I wanted to talk about what we're doing today, or something around the sort of sector of sales and marketing, and I go on a show and it's talking about customer service, it's not relevant. But it's too late then. I'm on the show, I look like an idiot sort of thing. So it's more about the quality, not the quantity of the shows that you're going on. So again, a lot of people have this target of, I want to be on 50 shows a month and I want to do this. It's like, yeah, but that's 50 low value conversations you're having with an audience. Do 4 really good high value conversations, maximize that content, have a strategy to evergreen it out and repurpose it and use it for targeted outreach with clients, because you've had this conversation in a podcast, but you've been thinking about it and you've already teed it up with a set of clients you want to reach out to, because you've talked about something that's relevant to their sector. So maybe you're targeting 1 quarter SaaS founders in the customer service sector. And it's like, okay, yep, we're talking about high value customer service and how we operate our platform and how it does that. So you've got a mechanism to go out with them. It's all about, it's like anything in sales outreach, it's all about the strategy around that. Podcast Hawk is obviously just a tool to help get there, but there's others as well. But the key is about having that sales outreach strategy and using the podcasts themselves, whether it's the data, the shows, advertising, sponsorship, as a way to get to that audience behind it, but do it in a focused manner. Sorry, a big rant about there, because it's one of those things of like agencies are, can I send 100,000 emails? And it's, no, go away, please. Not interested. No, it's just, you're gonna annoy everybody. And hosts, they put a lot of time and effort into what they're doing, and they've got an audience, and you've got to respect that, because they've built that audience and they've grown it, and it's something, it's a value. It's, Drew was saying, you've earned their trust, and you've earned their audience trust as well.
Now, that's a good point, Stewart. What are some things that you've seen for prospective guests to position themselves to be on one of these high quality podcasts? You talked about the importance of quality over quantity. Are there things you could do? There's this concept of pre-selling, right? Before I pitch you, how can I position myself to increase the likelihood of a yes? What have you seen there?
So there's a couple of different ways. It's a little bit like any sort of outreach. Some people, before they actually send an email, will go and find the host on LinkedIn or some of the social channels. They'll comment on YouTube. They'll do some reviews on the podcast itself. So they'll do like a warming up process from that side around it. The key component, what I've seen work really well, is when you're doing the outreach to a host, I won't swear, don't make things up. Listen to some of the contextual aspect of some of the podcasts that have been on there, and mention that in the outreach. I heard Kevin was on the show and he was talking about executive assistants. It's really awesome point. I think actually I could extend upon that. So take an interest. Promise value to the host as well and deliver on it. So if you say you're going to be on the show and you've got a newsletter of 10,000 people and a social network of X and a blog with a domain authority of Y, deliver on that. Don't say you're going to do something and give them reach and not do it, because it extends their audience out as well. And then finally, when you're actually doing that outreach, like I say, make it personalized. But if what I've done is I've done a little sort of 50-second, it's not personalized per se. It's not, hi Kevin, hi Drew, hi Anya. It's just a very, hey, I'm Stewart, love to be on your podcast. Here's who I am. Here's what I've done. Great, get in touch. Rather than just 2 sentences, there's a little bit of media there, a professional media kit with headshot bio. Do not make the host work for you is the key takeaway. If they've got to ask you for everything up front, it's a pain. So provide them with all the information that validates you've been on a show, you're an expert in whatever it may be, you've done X, Y, Z, here's the other shows that I've been on, here's how the reach is gained. Do not make them do their homework. They will do the homework, or a proper host will do the homework, but don't make them work for it. Provide them with everything from that side. And that gives you a higher increase of conversion from outreach. Whereas a lot of people just go down this route of, here's 1,000 podcasts about entrepreneurship, here's a generic email. I'm Bob, I should be on your show because I'm Bob and I'm great. Please have me on your show. And it's like any cold email that you get, it's just not relevant around it. But yeah, put some time and effort into it. And that's why I always say about the quantity, not the quality of it, not the quantity, sorry. The quantity is not a metric to measure in terms of outreach.
Yeah, and we just saw something similar when it comes to sponsorship outreach and trying to get sponsors. We've seen examples of quality over quantity there. Let's say that someone is sold on this strategy. What would be like the time to value for a founder running a business? They're sold on being a podcast guest as a way to boost sales. Like, what range would you say? Is it like SEO, where you wouldn't expect to land your first guest spot until 6 months to a year before that ROI starts to form? Or what is that range?
You can run a campaign. So I'm running campaigns for clients at the moment, and we were getting them on podcasts within the first week, because again, it's like anything, isn't it? Like I was just saying there, because we've done the legwork before that, we've done the research and we've targeted the shows and we've got the media kit and we've got everything ready. It's easier for a host. I'm going to say we've got them on the week. It doesn't mean they've actually recorded the show in that week. We've got a booking. So that conversion, that turnaround can be really quick from that side of things, because again, as you're starting out, you would target shows that only have 30 to 100 podcast episodes out there, because it's quicker to get on those shows and the sort of ramp is less. Whereas those that have got hundreds of shows and hundreds of episodes, that ramp time could be maybe 2 or 3 month lead time to get on that particular show. But in terms of bookings, yeah, you can get on there. And then the turnaround in terms of that return is based on how you drive that call to action. So when you finish that show yourself, are you sharing that out? The host is sharing it out on their network. Are you sharing it out with their network? Are you reusing that content? Are you actually, or are you just using it and dumping it and going, I've done that now, move on to the next one. So it's down to the strategy and input that you put in terms of how much return you'll get against it and how quick that return will come. But also, like SEO, it's evergreen. You can come back to it in 6 months' time and go, oh, actually, there's something in the press about XYZ. I think I mentioned something about that. Boom, get that snippet out there and repurpose it as well. But also link back into the host is interviewing lots of people. And if it's in your wheelhouse of where you want to be, build a relationship with them as well. Don't just do a Tinder date, swipe right, swipe left, whatever, and just walk away. Build a relationship with the hosts and talk to them, because they may have other guests that are potential people that you can sell to, that they're doing an introduction for. I was on a podcast last week and we're doing this event in Manchester, and the host has introduced me to a sponsor for that event. And literally it's like, wow, okay, that'll save me a load of hassle. So it's like any sort of methodology. You have to have a plan and strategy and work to it, but you can get a really quick return and a constant return from it. And it's something, again, you can dip in and out of it as well. You don't have to do it consistently. Maybe you do it on a seasonal basis and go, okay, I'm going to do this for a quarter. I'm going to maximize it for a quarter, and I'm going to go back in again and do it for another quarter from that side. Yeah, it's a long-winded answer, but yeah, you can get a very quick return very rapidly from that side, but put the effort in beforehand, put the time into it.
Yeah, I'd say ditto on building that relationship. I just was on a podcast a few hours ago, and the way that came together, host Bilal of Creator Lab, I was on his podcast and he sent me a text message saying, hey, Greg Eisenberg wants you on his podcast, but they don't know how to reach you. But that only happened because Bilal and I continued building that relationship after we did that interview. So I think that's a powerful point, Stewart.
It definitely is. And it is that network effect that, again, think of the hosts as just creating backlinks for you in terms of making those introductions and potentially looking for customers. And again, there's still some shows that I was on a year or so ago. Chris Williamson, he's reached out with some introductions for Podcast Hawk and some other stuff, and that was over a year ago. It's got a great memory as well, but it's just pure value. But again, think of it as building that network and those relationships, and anything in a sort of sales engagement and methodology. Really good salespeople sweat that network, but give value back as well. They don't just take, they give back as well, and that's the key thing. So if a host comes to you and says, oh, I've got some intros and I've done this, that's great, then go back to them and say, hey, if you can find some other guests for them to do some introductions or some outreach or give them some, the main thing is go and review that podcast and give them a review. That's gold in itself. Do not ever forget to do that. It's bad karma. But yeah, think about it around general sort of strategy type of thing.
Stewart, I have a question about this podcast score. What are the inputs to that? Do you guys take into account anything like growth rate? As someone who's pretty early on, audience-wise, I haven't really thought about building an audience. I've mainly focused on, I just do better in smaller groups naturally and building closer relationships. I find myself thinking about a strategy of going more on up-and-coming. Is that going to be more of a taste thing by me, that's qualitative, or is there data around growth rate?
So there isn't at the moment, but there is data going in there. So at the moment, the Podcast Hawk score is based on regular releases of episodes, number of reviews, is it trending upwards, those data points, and social metrics as well pushed in there. And we used to push some of the social data in there as well, but again, we just removed that. But now we're starting to get domain authority and website data. That's starting to go in there because we're going to use that as a trend of growth from that side, because we don't know, well, only the podcast host has access to the audience numbers and downloads and that sort of thing, and that's never going to be public. That's their gold. We're going to base it on if they've got a website, are they starting to see more backlinks? Are they starting to see more traffic? Is the metrics there? Because like yourself, Kevin, we've got agencies, and what they want to find is those podcasts that are starting to grow and trend before anybody else to get their clients on there. Because like I say, it could be Bill Gates did a podcast a couple of years ago, only about 10 episodes or something. So if you did a normal search, I'm not going on that. It's rubbish. It's only 10 episodes, but it's Bill Gates. So it's looking for those prevailing factors with some of these data points that we're getting and start to pull into the platform that will go into that scoring system with the idea that we'll produce charts based on that increase. So there are Podchaser talks about this audience growth and here's the top 25 podcasts, and Raphonic do it as well. I have to be very careful and sensitive around this. So we will never use data that is averaged or estimated from that side. We only use data that we can verify comes from either our database or a third-party source that's verified. We won't estimate. So a lot of the data points on audience and demographics, people are estimating it based on non-factual data is the best way of describing it. So that's the only thing that we'll do is base that sort of growth score on the data we can validate from that. And a lot of that will be around web traffic data and that sort of thing. Because again, Bill Gates, if we would have had that working and that data in there, we would have seen that and gone, yeah, okay, there's one you need to be on because he's got 3 shows and it's going great sort of thing. Or here's an up and coming founder that's just took his Series A and he's started to get a podcast, but he's getting Tim Ferriss on his podcast and people like that. I was doing some research before for a client, I was looking at stuff, and there was a podcast I never heard of that had some baller people on it. Tim Ferriss and some other people have been on there. I'd never heard of this person in my life. But it's a little bit like I don't know if Web Summit, a big European tech conference. The way Paddy set that up originally was he spoke to the chaps at Twitter and said, yeah, come and speak, because I've got the chaps from Facebook speaking and I've got the chaps. Nobody was speaking. It was just playing them all off against each other side of things. It was just blagging it. And now Web Summit is like a 30,000 person conference. But yeah, long-winded answer, but there's going to be more metrics going into there and more sort of tabular data to look for the trends and predict them, so that people can go, actually, yeah, that's where I want to be. I want to be in that up and coming cycle, not when it's hit the cusp. I want to be down here. That's my data nerdism. When we can get to that point, I'll be well happy.
Yeah, that's a great point, finding that pocket of those up and coming so you can catch that wave early. We're coming up on time. Does anyone else have any questions for Stewart before we wrap up? And it looks like we don't. Stewart, do you have any closing comments? Thank you for putting together the great presentation.
No, that's cool. I really enjoyed it. It was good. I know we started with a lot of data. I just like to tell people about the size of podcasting and sort of that growth type of thing, because again, it's under taxed resource type of thing. But yeah, no, thanks for inviting me, Drew, as well. Been awesome. Yeah.
The data was interesting to me as well. It also sets the table for why should we care, because you can get into strategy and tactics, but if we're not convinced that this is a viable strategy or worth our time, then we're multiplying times 0 by then. So I think it was a great start.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I put it together originally when I was talking about this, because if we don't have any quantitative and qualitative sort of type of data that gives you a contextual sense of, yeah, it's a large enough market, I can go and target different demographics or languages. It's like you say, strategy means nothing because I'm not vested. I'm not going to go and do it. So that was good, I think.
Yeah, so it was useful, went well for the people that are here, and I hope it also translates, I'm sure it will, to the people that watch the recording. So thanks again, Stewart. Hope everybody has a great week. Later.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Enjoy your week.